Born Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruiz, Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926. Being the third of 6 children, his father was a wealthy plantation owner from Spain. Castro was educated in a private Jesuit school, and while the majority of the country was impoverished, he grew up rather wealthy. Showing that he was intellectually gifted from an early age, Castro wasn't really interested in studies as he'd rather play sports instead, some of which he earned scholarships for in college. However, after his graduation in 1945 from Havana University, he entered law school, and his interest in Cuban nationalism, socialism, and anti-imperialism grew. Being more enthralled by his interest in social justice and anti-imperialism ideals, he traveled to Colombia to participate in the anti-government rallying occurring there, only to later return later on that year to join the anti-communist party in an attempt to reform the existing government. During his time with the political party, he met Mirta Diaz-Balart, who he went on to start a family with. His new relationship opened up new political doors for him and exposed him to Karl Marx. This led him to running. General Batista declared himself a dictator and consolidated his power. Castro reacted by rallying his supporters, and on July 26, 1953, Castro and about 150 of his men attacked the Moncada military barracks. This attack ultimately failed, and they were sentenced to 15 years in prison. They were released in 1955 due to a deal with the government, and Castro decided to take his revolutionary ideas to Mexico. While there, he rallied his supporters there and met Ernest Guevara, who only influenced him to be more radical and more violent. In 1956, they returned to Cuba, only to have most of their numbers killed or successful military operations to capture and hold many of Cuba's large cities. With the capture of these key areas, Batista began to lose the support of the populace and had to flee the island in the January of 1959. From there, he officially closed his military campaign and established a provisional government, setting Manuel Orisha as president and Jose Muro Cardona as prime minister. They quickly began diplomatic relations with the U.S., and in February of that year, Cardona resigned for unknown reasons and swore in Castro. All the while, they tried and sentenced hundreds of Batista's men to death. From there, Castro set into motion a plan to end all U.S. economic dominance on the Latin island. They essentially raised the taxes on the island and caused a large strain on the American-based companies on Cuban soil. Not only did it hurt relations with the privatized American industries, but it also hurt relations with the American government. While this was going on, Castro denied any allegations stating that he was in any sort of contact with the communists. Although his new policies resembled Soviet dominance, in the April of 1959, Castro visited the U.S., but President Eisenhower refused to meet him. That next month, Castro signed the first Land Reform Act, the first of many, which led to state land control and made farmers more like government workers than like actual farmers. By the end of that year, Castro had purged anyone who criticized his reforms. He was particularly fond of executions, imprisonments, and exiles, although he did all three. The new regime established diplomatic relations with the USSR, to which the Soviet Union sent advisors to help strengthen the defenses of Cuba. In the 1960s, Cuba signed a trade agreement to buy oil from the Soviet Union. This sparked many problems among the American refineries, who flat out refused to process the oil. Cuba responded by cutting the sugar export, which only put a further strain on relations between the two countries. However, everything went downhill from there. In 1961, President Eisenhower broke off all relations with Cuba, and in April of that year, Castro declared Cuba a socialist state. A few days later, Cuban exiles attacked Cuba in the remote Bay of Pigs, later to be known as the Bay of Pigs attack. The attack failed miserably and ended with hundreds of exiles being killed and the rest being captured. Although the U.S. denied any involvement with the attack, one of the insurgents later revealed that the CIA had trained them, only to be revealed later from the U.S. that the U.S. had planned to overthrow Castro and his regime. President John F. Kennedy launched the attack but denied the Cuban exiles any air support in an effort to conceal the U.S. involvement. However, Castro saw an opportunity and capitalized. The U.S. responded by imposing a full embargo in 1962. By the end of 1962, the Cuban government was so reliant on the Soviets' support that it nearly caused a nuclear war. With Castro and the Russian president planning to put nukes in Cuba, it was it began to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, apparently as a reaction to the U.S. placement of missiles in Turkey. A spy plane later found out the construction site and ordered the missiles to be removed. 13 days later, they came to an agreement and made Cuba a total laughingstock by not involving them. However, in 1965, he merged the Communist Party and Revolutionary Parties of Cuba to support reform all over the world. In the 70s, he promoted himself as a spokesperson for underdeveloped countries. Now, the U.S. attempted to stop him through an estimated 638 assassination attempts. And while he did a lot of controversial things, Castro did increase literacy, open schools, provide a universal health care, and decrease infant mortality rates. However, he still took some civil liberties away, such as freedom of speech, religion, and a right to land. During his tyranny, thousands of Cubans fled or died, attempting to flee to other countries in hopes of finding a sanctuary or haven. However, many ended up in Florida and around the world. And in 2006, he shifted power to his brother, and later died 10 years later. On November 25th of 2016, Castro died at the age of 90 years old.